She didn't mean to climb into a stranger's car. She didn't see the silent authority waiting behind the wheel. And she definitely didn't expect to drift into a deep sleep inches away from a man who ruled the city's shadows with a glance. By the time the exhausted nurse opened her eyes, the hospital was miles behind them, the doors were sealed tight against the storm, and Min Jae Kang, the most lethal man in the underworld, was watching her with a curiosity that could either be her salvation or her end. If you're just tuning in, please like, subscribe, share, and click the notification button for more engaging stories. Your support means everything. Now let's dive in. The sky was a bruised purple, and the rain fell in heavy rhythmic sheets that turned the hospital parking lot into a blurred landscape of neon and gray. Janelle Thompson pushed through the heavy glass doors, her light blue scrubs wrinkled and damp from a shift that felt a lifetime long. 12 hours of holding hands with the dying, documenting every heartbeat, and carrying a responsibility that never seemed to let her go. Her mind was a fog of fatigue. Her rideshare app flashed a notification, black sedan arriving. When a sleek, dark vehicle glided to the curb right in front of her, Janelle didn't think twice. She yanked open the heavy door and collapsed into the front passenger seat, the smell of expensive leather and cool sandalwood instantly replacing the clinical scent of antiseptic. "Sorry, I'm just so tired," she breathed, not even looking toward the driver's side. "Just head toward the downtown apartments." She didn't notice the silence was too heavy. She didn't notice the driver's tailored white shirt or the expensive watch catching the dashboard light. She didn't notice the way the man behind the wheel went perfectly still, his dark eyes shifting from the road to the woman who had just invaded his sanctuary. The car eased into motion. Within minutes, the rhythmic swipe of the windshield wipers lulled her into a deep, trusting sleep. Min Jae Kang was a man who planned for every variable and anticipated every threat. He had built an empire on cold logic and ironclad self-control, never once being caught off guard. Until now. He stared at the young woman slumped beside him, her head tilted toward the window, her curls spilling over her shoulder, and her hospital ID badge glowing softly in the dark. A nurse, fragile, exhausted, completely unguarded. For a man used to being feared, Janelle's accidental trust was a shock to the system, an anomaly he couldn't quite bring himself to remove. As he watched her breathe, Min Jae realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't interested in the destination. He was interested in the passenger. The sky over the city wasn't just raining, it was morning. Dark, bruised clouds hung low, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the hospital parking lot into a chaotic sea of gray and neon reflections. Janelle Thompson pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the East Side Medical Center, the sudden blast of humid, cold air hitting her like a physical blow. She stood under the concrete awning for a moment, her chest heaving as she let the automatic doors hiss shut behind her. Her light blue scrubs, once crisp and professional at 6 a.m., were now a map of a battlefield. There was a faint smear of iodine on her left sleeve, a damp patch from a spilled saline bag on her hip, and a weariness in her marrow that felt heavier than the lead aprons in the X-ray department. 12 hours. It had been a shift designed to break a person. She had spent the last 4 hours in Trauma Room 3, her sneakers slipping on the linoleum as she performed chest compressions on a teenager whose life was leaking out through a jagged glass wound. She had held the hand of an elderly woman who spoke only in whispers of a daughter who was never going to arrive in time. She had been a healer, a counselor, a witness, and a punching bag for the frustrations of a system that was constantly running out of beds. Janelle reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of lines bisecting the notification that glowed through the gloom. "Your ride is arriving, black sedan." She squinted through the shifting curtain of water. About 50 feet away, a car was idling near the curb. Its headlights were two blurry orbs of white light cutting through the deluge. It was sleek, dark, and looked like a sanctuary. "Please," she whispered to herself, her voice raspy from hours of shouting over the hum of ventilators and the beeping of monitors. "Just let me get home." She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't even have the energy to pull her hood up properly. Janelle tucked her phone into her waistband, took a deep breath of the metallic-smelling air, and bolted. The rain was an instant, punishing weight. Within 3 steps, her curls were plastered to her forehead. Within 10, her socks were squelching inside her sneakers. Every splash in a deep puddle felt like a personal insult from the universe. She ran toward the idling car, her eyes fixed on the taillights that burned like embers in the storm. As she reached the vehicle, she didn't stop to check the license plate. She didn't look at the driver through the rain-streaked windows. She simply grabbed the handle of the front passenger door, an instinctive move as if she needed to be as close to the exit of her own life as possible, and yanked it open. A wave of dry, expensive warmth rolled out to meet her. It smelled of aged leather, a hint of something metallic, and a deep, sophisticated scent of sandalwood. It was a world away from the sharp, stinging odor of bleach and suffering she had lived in all day. Janelle collapsed into the seat, her wet scrubs making a soft squelch against the pristine black leather. She slammed the door shut, sealing out the roar of the storm, and for a second she just leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The silence inside the car was absolute, heavy and pressurized, like the interior of a vault. "Thank God," she exhaled, her voice catching. She didn't look to her right. She couldn't. Her eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead. "I'm so sorry about the water. I'll tip you extra, I promise. Just downtown. The Willow Creek Apartments. Please." She reached up, fumbling with the seatbelt, her movements slow and clumsy. Her fingers brushed against the center console, polished wood and cold metal, and she noticed, vaguely, that this was the nicest rideshare she'd ever been in. There were no discarded water bottles, no dangling air fresheners, no humming radio playing top 40 hits. There was only the soft, rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers. "I had the worst day," she muttered, more to the dashboard than to the driver. The adrenaline that had kept her upright for 12 hours was draining out of her, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. "You have no idea. People they just keep breaking. And you try to fix them, and sometimes you do, but sometimes—" Her voice trailed off. Her head lolled to the side, resting against the cool glass of the window. The heat from the vents was blowing softly against her ankles, and the seat beneath her felt like it was molding to her exhausted frame. She didn't notice that the driver hadn't said a word. She didn't notice that he hadn't started the meter or looked at a GPS. She didn't see the way his gloved hand, resting on the steering wheel, tightened just a fraction. In the dim light of the dashboard, Janelle's face was a study in pure, unadulterated fatigue. The dark circles under her eyes were like bruises, and her breathing was beginning to even out into the slow, heavy rhythm of deep sleep. She looked like a bird that had flown into a window, stunned, fragile, and utterly unaware of the predator whose nest she had just crashed into. Beside her, Min Jae-kang sat in a stillness that was terrifying. He was dressed in a white button-down shirt that was so crisp it looked lethal, his dark hair swept back from a face that was a mask of cold, calculated precision. He had been waiting for a very different kind of passenger, a man who owed him information, a man who would have entered this car with shaking hands and a plea for mercy. Instead he had a nurse. He watched her through the periphery of his vision. He saw the hospital ID badge clipped to her pocket, Janelle Thompson, RN, and the way her fingers remained curled even in sleep, as if she were still trying to hold on to someone's life. His first instinct was to reach for the weapon tucked into the holster beneath his ribs. His second was to simply shove her back out into the rain. He was a man of shadows, a man who dealt in the currency of fear and silence. A witness was a liability. An intruder was a threat. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw the bone-deep exhaustion he recognized from his own mirror. He saw a person who had given everything until there was nothing left but the shell. A slow, dangerous curiosity flickered in his chest. Min-jae didn't put the car in park. He didn't wake her up. Instead, he reached out with one finger and adjusted the climate control, turning the heat up just a few degrees to keep the shivering woman beside him warm. The car glided away from the hospital curb, turning not toward Willow Creek, but toward the private high-rise heart of the city. As the rain continued to hammer against the roof, Janelle slept on, her head tilting toward the man who held her life in his silent, steady hands. The blue scrubber's mistake was made, and as the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and red, the world she knew was already fading into the rearview mirror. The luxury sedan moved through the city with the predatory grace of a shark cutting through deep water. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic, muffled click of the turn signal and the persistent hum of the climate control. Min Jae-kang kept his eyes on the road, but his focus was entirely localized on the woman breathing softly in his passenger seat. He had spent his life surrounded by people who were constantly on guard. Men who wore their paranoia like a second skin and women who used their beauty as a shield or a weapon. He lived in a world of sharp edges and hidden motives. Yet here was a stranger who had walked into his private sanctum, barked an order at him as if he were a servant, and then surrendered completely to the darkness of sleep. It was an affront to his reputation, and yet he found himself slowing down as he hit a pothole, an instinctive physical reaction to keep her head from banging against the window. At a long red light beneath the glow of a flickering neon sign, Min-jae finally allowed himself to turn his head. He didn't just look at her. He studied her with the clinical precision he usually reserved for balance sheets or tactical maps. She was beautiful, though it was a beauty currently obscured by the toll of a life spent in service to others. Her skin was a deep, rich bronze, luminous even in the dim amber glow of the dashboard lights. A stray curl had escaped her ponytail, resting against the curve of her cheek, rising and falling with every slow, even breath. He noticed the faint indentation on the bridge of her nose, the mark of a surgical mask worn too long. Then there was the scent. Min-jae's world smelled of expensive cologne, gun oil, aged whiskey, and the metallic tang of blood. But the air around this woman was different. It was a complex, contradictory layering that fascinated him. Beneath the top note of rainwater and damp fabric, there was the sharp, stinging scent of antiseptic and isopropyl alcohol, the smell of the hospital. But deeper still, radiating from the warmth of her neck, was something soft and organic. It was vanilla and cocoa butter, a domestic, comforting aroma that felt almost violent in its contrast to the life he led. She smelled like a home he had never known. He looked down at her hands. They were resting in her lap, palms up, fingers slightly curled. They were strong hands, but the knuckles were red from constant scrubbing. He found himself wondering about the breaking people she had mentioned before she drifted off. He dealt in the business of breaking people. She, apparently, dealt in the business of putting them back together. The light turned green, but Min-jae didn't move immediately. A car honked behind him, a shrill, impatient sound that sliced through the rain. Janelle stirred, a small, pained whimper escaping her lips, and her brow furrowed as if the noise had chased her into a nightmare. Min-jae's gaze snapped to the rearview mirror, a flash of genuine coldness flickering in his eyes for the driver behind him. He accelerated smoothly, leaving the noise behind, his movements deliberate and protective. He should have been annoyed. His evening had been meticulously planned. He had a meeting with the heads of the Joycean syndicate to discuss territory, a high-stakes negotiation where any sign of weakness or distraction could be fatal. Having a civilian, a nurse no less, in his car was more than a distraction. It was a security breach. If his enemies saw her, she would become a target. If his men saw her, they would wonder if their leader had finally lost his edge. And yet, he made no move to wake her. He found himself fascinated by her vulnerability. In his world, vulnerability was a death sentence. You didn't sleep until the locks were bolted and the cameras were live. You didn't trust a closed door, let alone a stranger in a car. But she had seen the black BMW, felt the warmth of the leather, and decided she was safe. It was a staggering level of trust, even if it was born of pure bone-deep exhaustion. As he drove, he took a longer route, heading toward the coastal road where the traffic was thinner and the streetlights were fewer. He wanted to see how long this peace would last. He wanted to understand the gravity of a life that could leave a person so drained that they could fall asleep in the den of a lion. He reached over, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder. He intended to shake her, to demand to know exactly who she was and why she was so careless. But as his fingers neared the soft fabric of her scrubs, he stopped. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, a living, pulsing warmth that felt startlingly vital. Instead of waking her, he adjusted the rearview mirror so he could watch her face while he drove. He watched the way her eyelashes cast long shadows over her cheekbones. He watched the way her chest rose and fell in a perfect, peaceful cadence. He found himself matching his own breathing to hers, a rhythmic synchronization that felt strangely intimate. For the first time in years, the constant, low-level hum of tension in Min-jae's shoulders began to dissipate. He wasn't just a boss, a killer, or a legacy. In the quiet of the car, with the rain shielding them from the rest of the world, he was simply a man watching a woman sleep. He knew this couldn't last. Eventually, the sun would rise or she would wake up, and the reality of their worlds would collide. She would see the coldness in his eyes, and he would have to decide what to do with a witness who had seen him at his most human. But for now, as the car swept through the dark, rain-slicked streets, Min-jae Kang was content to be the silent watcher. He breathed in the scent of antiseptic and vanilla, letting the quiet dignity of her exhaustion settle over him like a shroud. He wasn't ready to let the world back in yet. He turned the car toward the private entrance of his penthouse, the wheels whispering against the asphalt. The nurse was still sleeping, her head now leaning slightly toward him as if drawn to his heat. Min-jae didn't pull away. He simply gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and drove into the shadows, keeping his passengers safe in a world that usually offered no such mercy. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was not a sudden jump, but a slow, disorienting crawl out of a deep fog. Janelle's first sensation was the absence of the hospital's rhythmic hum. There were no distant sirens, no squeaking cart wheels, and no overhead pages for Dr. Miller to return to the ER. Instead, there was a silence so profound it felt expensive. As her consciousness flickered to life, she became aware of a lingering warmth against her cheek. The air around her didn't smell like the damp, cramped hallway of her apartment building. It smelled of cold rain, high-end leather, and that intoxicating, spicy scent of sandalwood. She blinked, her eyelashes fluttering against her skin. The world was still dark, but the rain had subsided to a soft, persistent mist that clung to the windows. She realized her head was resting at an awkward angle, and as she shifted, she felt the smooth, cool surface of a luxury headrest. Then memory hit her like a shot of adrenaline. The hospital. The rain. The black sedan. Janelle bolted upright, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked out the window, expecting to see the familiar, chipped brick facade of the Willow Creek apartments. Instead, she saw a sprawling, ultra-modern courtyard paved in charcoal stone, illuminated by recessed floor lighting that cast long, dramatic shadows. Huge, manicured maples stood like sentinels in the mist. This wasn't home. You're awake. The voice was low, resonant, and entirely too calm. It carried the texture of velvet pulled over a blade of steel. Janelle gasped, spinning toward the driver's side. She had forgotten, or perhaps her exhausted brain had never truly registered, that she wasn't alone. Sitting behind the wheel, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the dashboard, was the man. He wasn't wearing the casual attire of a rideshare driver. He wore a white button-down shirt so perfectly pressed it looked like armor, and his hands, draped casually over the steering wheel, were encased in thin black leather gloves. He hadn't turned the car off. The engine purred with a low, predatory vibration that Janelle could feel in her teeth. "Where am I?" she stammered, her hand instinctively flying to her throat, her fingers brushing against her damp ID badge. "This isn't my apartment." "Who are you?" The man turned his head slowly. In the dim light, his features were strikingly sharp, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes that were so dark they seemed to swallow the light. He didn't look angry, he looked profoundly, dangerously patient. "You gave me directions to an apartment complex 3 miles back," he said. His voice was steady, devoid of the irritation most people would show toward a stranger who had just hijacked their private car for a nap. "I decided not to leave you there." Janelle's blood ran cold. The exhaustion that had felt like a heavy blanket only moments ago was replaced by a sharp, jagged panic. She lunged for the door handle, her fingers fumbling with the lock mechanism, but the heavy door remained sealed. "Open the door," she demanded, her voice rising an octave. I don't know what you think this is, but I'm a nurse. My hospital knows exactly where I am. I called an Uber, I must have gotten the wrong car, I'm sorry, just let me out." The man didn't move. He didn't flinch at her outburst. He simply watched her, his gaze tracking the frantic movement of her eyes, the way her chest heaved under her blue scrubs. "If I wanted to hurt you, Janelle Thompson, I wouldn't have waited for you to finish your sleep," he said softly. She froze at the sound of her name. Her eyes dropped to her chest, realizing he had been reading her badge while she slept. The intimacy of that realization sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with her damp clothes. "How long was I out?" she whispered, her hand dropping from the door. "An hour. Perhaps a little more." He reached forward and pressed a button on the console. The locks clicked open with a sound like a suppressed heartbeat. "The doors are open. You are free to walk back into the rain. But you are currently in a private estate 3 miles from your home, in wet clothes with a dead phone in your pocket." Janelle reached for her phone, realizing he was right. The screen was black, the battery drained by the long shift and the cold. She looked back at him, her fear beginning to mingle with a strange, defiant curiosity. There was something about the way he sat, the absolute stillness of his posture, that reminded her of the high-ranking surgeons back at the hospital, men who held life and death in their hands every day. But this man's authority didn't come from a degree. It came from power. "Why didn't you just wake me up?" she asked, her voice steadier now. "Why bring me here?" Min Jae Kong leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was curious," he admitted. The honesty in his voice was more unsettling than a lie would have been. "People don't usually fall asleep in my presence. They usually spend their time trying to find a way out of it." He reached into the back seat and produced a thick, charcoal gray cashmere blanket. He held it out to her, the movement fluid and deliberate. "You were shivering," he added. Janelle looked at the blanket, then at his gloved hand. She should have run. She should have pushed the door open and sprinted back toward the main road until her lungs burned. But as she looked into his dark, unreadable eyes, she saw something that stopped her. He wasn't looking at her like a predator looks at prey. He was looking at her like she was a puzzle he hadn't expected to solve. She reached out, her fingers glancing against the leather of his glove as she took the blanket. It was incredibly soft and it smelled faintly of him, that sandalwood and rain. "I'm Min-jae," he said, and though he didn't offer a last name, the way he said it suggested that one wasn't necessary. "And you are the first person in 5 years to give me directions as if I were a servant." Janelle felt a flush of heat creep up her neck, a mixture of embarrassment and a strange, sparky tension. "I was tired. I told you I had a shift. People were breaking. And you fixed them," Min-jae said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He reached out not to touch her but to point toward her badge. "A healer. It's a heavy burden to carry into the wrong car." He put the car into gear, the headlights sweeping across the stone walls of the courtyard as he began to turn the vehicle around. "I will take you home now, Janelle," he said, his gaze returning to the road. "But I think you should be more careful about whose sanctuary you choose for a bed. The next man might not be so interested in the scent of vanilla and antiseptic." Janelle wrapped the cashmere blanket around her shoulders, the warmth finally beginning to seep into her bones. She didn't answer. She sat in the passenger seat of the most dangerous man in the city, watching the rain-streaked world go by, realizing that while she was finally going home, the quiet, predictable life of Janelle Thompson, RN, had ended the moment she closed that car door. Min-jae Kang didn't look at her again for the rest of the drive, but she could feel his awareness of her. A heavy, magnetic presence that filled the car, making the 3-mile journey feel like a crossing into an entirely different world. When he finally pulled up to her apartment complex, he didn't wait for a tip. He didn't wait for a thank you. He simply unlocked the doors and waited. As Janelle stepped out into the night, she turned back, the expensive blanket still clutched in her hand. "The blanket," she started. "Keep it," he said, his eyes catching the light of a street lamp. "You look like you still have more shifts ahead of you." Before she could respond, the black sedan glided away, disappearing into the mist like a ghost. Janelle stood on the sidewalk, the cold rain hitting her face, holding a piece of cashmere that cost more than her month's rent, wondering if she had just survived a nightmare or started a dream. The following 3 days were a blur of sterile routines and lingering ghosts. Janelle tried to return to the rhythm of the hospital, but the mundanity of charting vitals and changing 4 bags felt strangely hollow. Every time a black car pulled into the ambulance bay, her heart would skip a beat, a physical jolt of adrenaline that left her breathless and annoyed with herself. She had kept the cashmere blanket. It sat on the foot of her bed, a heavy, soft weight that smelled less of sandalwood with every passing hour, reminding her that the encounter had actually happened and wasn't just a hallucination born of sleep deprivation. She was finishing a double shift on a Tuesday, her joints aching and her mind cataloging the patients she'd lost and the ones she'd stabilized. The storm from the weekend had passed, leaving the city air crisp and biting. As she stepped out of the hospital's staff exit, the sun was beginning to dip below the skyline, casting long amber shadows across the pavement. And there it was. The black sedan was idling exactly where it had been 3 nights ago. It didn't belong here. Its polished, obsidian paint job and aggressive silhouette stood out against the dented hatchbacks and dusty SUVs of the hospital staff. It looked like a tear in the fabric of her reality. Janelle's footsteps slowed. She felt a familiar prickle of fear, but beneath it, a surging, defiant curiosity. She didn't run this time. She walked toward the car with the deliberate pace of someone who was reclaiming their agency. As she approached, the rear window glided down with a soft, mechanical whir. Min-jae Kang sat in the back seat this time. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than her nursing degree, his hands resting motionless on his knees. He looked less like a driver and more like the king of a country she hadn't found on any map. "You look tired again, Janelle," he said. His voice was just as she remembered, low, steady, and carrying that velvet over steel weight. "It's the job," she replied, stopping a few feet from the door. She crossed her arms over her scrubs, trying to hide the way her hands were shaking. "Did you come to collect your blanket? I can go up and get it, but it'll take a few minutes." Min-jae tilted his head slightly, a small ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. "The blanket was a gift. I don't take back gifts. I came because I have a proposition for you." Janelle let out a dry, weary laugh. "If this is about a rideshare service, I think I've learned my lesson." "It's about your skills," Min-jae said, his expression turning serious. He gestured toward the seat beside him. "The hospital is a cage for someone with your talent. You spend half your time fighting paperwork and the other half fighting a system that doesn't care about the people you treat. I'm offering you a different kind of practice. Janelle hesitated. Every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to turn around and walk back into the safety of the fluorescent-lit halls. But she remembered the way he had watched her sleep, not with malice but with a strange, protective restraint. She remembered the feeling of being seen in a way that had nothing to do with her badge or her shift. She reached out, pulled open the door and sat down. The interior of the car was just as silent and insulated as before. Min-jae didn't move toward her. He kept a respectful distance, but his presence seemed to fill the entire cabin. He handed her a small, elegant folder. I maintain a private clinic, he began, his eyes fixed on her. It is discreet. It serves people who cannot go to East Side Medical without attracting the wrong kind of attention. People who have no insurance, no records and very few options. They need someone who doesn't ask questions but who provides the best care possible. They need a healer who isn't afraid of the dark. Janelle opened the folder. Inside were photos of a state-of-the-art medical facility, clean, modern, and better equipped than the trauma unit she currently worked in. There were also documents detailing a salary that made her heart stutter. It was enough to pay off her student loans in a year and still have enough left to move out of Willow Creek. You want me to be a mob doctor, she said, her voice flat. I want you to be a doctor for people who are hurting, Min-jae corrected softly. The politics of who they are is my concern. Your concern would be their survival. You would have every resource you've ever lacked. No bureaucracy. No insurance adjusters. Just the medicine. Janelle looked up from the folder, meeting his dark, unreadable eyes. Why me? You could hire any surgeon in the city for this kind of money. Because you fell asleep, Min-jae said. In a world where everyone is looking for an angle, you were the only person I've met who was simply human. You have a quiet dignity, Janelle. You care for people because it is who you are, not because you are told to. My people need that. I need that. The I hung in the air between them, heavy and significant. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a bridge. He was inviting her into the shadows, offering her a chance to practice her craft without the chains of the system, but at the cost of entering a world where the rules were written in blood. I need to think about it, she whispered, her mind racing. Of course, Min-jae said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek business card with nothing but a phone number embossed in gold. But don't think too long. The world doesn't stop breaking just because you're resting. He signaled to the driver and the car began to move. He didn't take her home this time. He simply drove her to the edge of the hospital parking lot where her own modest car was parked. As she stepped out, the cool evening air hit her, but it didn't feel as cold as before. She stood on the asphalt, watching the black sedan merge into the city traffic and disappear. She looked down at the gold-embossed card in her hand. For the first time in years, Janelle Thompson didn't feel like a cog in a machine. She felt like a woman standing at a crossroads. The shadow had returned and this time, it hadn't just watched her, it had invited her to dance. The golden embossed card sat on Janelle's nightstand for exactly 48 hours before she dialed the number. She didn't call because of the money, though the thought of a life without debt felt like coming up for air after a lifetime underwater. She called because the hospital felt smaller now. Every time she looked at the overcrowded waiting room or the patients being discharged too early to make room for the next crisis, she thought of Min-jae's voice. A healer who isn't afraid of the dark. The black sedan arrived 10 minutes after her call. It wasn't the driver who opened the door this time, but Min-jae himself. He was dressed in a black turtleneck and a tailored overcoat, looking less like a businessman and more like a shadow made flesh. He didn't say much as the car glided through the city, navigating away from the familiar neon-lit boulevards and into an industrial district where the warehouses were tall, windowless, and silent. They pulled up to a nondescript brick building. To any passerby, it looked like a defunct textile factory, but when Min-jae placed his hand against a sleek biometric scanner hidden behind a rusted pipe, the heavy steel doors slid open with a whisper of high-grade hydraulics. Inside, Janelle gasped. The air was pressurized and perfectly filtered, carrying that familiar, crisp scent of O2 and high-end filtration. The floors were polished white marble and the walls were lined with frosted glass. It was more than a clinic, it was a medical sanctuary. Min-jae led her through the central hub, pointing out the diagnostic suite equipped with an MRI machine that was 2 generations ahead of the one at Eastside Medical. Everything here is off the grid, Min-jae explained, his voice echoing softly in the pristine hallway. The power comes from a private grid. The supplies are sourced through channels that don't require a paper trail. No one is logged by a social security number here. They are simply patients. They stopped at a glass-walled recovery room. Inside, a man sat on the edge of a bed, his torso wrapped in heavy gauze. His face was a map of old scars, and his eyes had the hard, flat look of someone who had seen things that would keep Janelle awake for a week. Standing over him was a veteran nurse Janelle recognized from a different hospital, a woman who had disappeared from the public sector years ago. "This is the reality," Min-jae said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register. "The man in that bed was shot in an alley 3 blocks from your hospital. If he had gone to your ER, the police would have been called before the anesthesia hit his system. He would have died in a cell or at the hands of the men who shot him. Here he lives." Janelle walked up to the glass, her reflection ghosting over the wounded man. "And what happens when he heals? Does he go back to the streets? Does he go back to hurting people?" Min-jae stepped up behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of him, the sheer gravity of his presence. "Some do. Some don't. But is that the question a healer asks? In your trauma bay, do you check a man's criminal record before you start the chest compressions? Or do you just see a heart that has stopped beating?" The question hit Janelle with the force of a physical blow. It was the ultimate moral gray area, the place where her Hippocratic oath met the cold reality of the underworld. She looked at the medical equipment, the ventilators, the surgical lasers, the rows of life-saving medications, and then she looked at Min-jae. "You're asking me to be the judge, jury, and executioner by deciding who deserves to live based on their life choices," she whispered. "No," Min-jae corrected, stepping closer so that she could see the reflection of his dark eyes in the glass. "I'm asking you to stop being a judge. I'm asking you to be a nurse. I provide the protection and the patience. You provide the mercy. Is mercy only for those who follow the rules, Janelle?" She looked back at the patient. He was a soldier, likely one of Min-jae's men, a person who lived by violence. But as she watched him wince while the nurse changed his dressing, she didn't see a criminal. She saw a man in pain. She saw a jagged entry wound that hadn't been cleaned properly. She saw a human being who was one infection away from sepsis. Her hands, the hands that had been red and raw from hospital-grade soap for years, suddenly felt steady. "I won't carry a weapon," she said, her voice gaining a new, firm edge. "And I won't be told who to save. If someone comes through those doors, regardless of who they are or what they've done, I treat them. And if the police come looking, I don't lie, I just don't speak." Min-jae watched her, a look of profound respect, and something else, something softer, flickering in his eyes. "The police do not come here. And I would never ask you to be anything other than what you are. That is why I brought you here." He walked to a cabinet and pulled out a set of scrubs. They weren't the faded, scratchy cotton of the hospital. They were a deep, midnight navy, made of a fabric that felt like silk against the skin but was durable enough for a battlefield. He handed them to her, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through Janelle's arm, a sharp reminder that this man was as much a part of the healing as the machines were. "Your first patient is in room 4, Min-jae said. "He's a courier. He was caught in a crossfire this morning. He's stable, but he needs someone who knows how to handle a delicate suture." Janelle took the scrubs. She felt the weight of the choice she was making, the way she was stepping out of the light of the proper world and into Min-jae's shadow. It was a different kind of healing, one that didn't come with accolades or public gratitude. It came with secrecy, danger, and a connection to a man who was as lethal as he was captivating. "Room 4, she repeated, her voice clear. As she walked toward the changing room, she felt Min-jae's gaze following her. She knew that by putting on those navy scrubs, she was becoming a part of his world. She was no longer just the nurse who had entered the wrong car. She was the woman who had seen the man behind the Mafia boss, and she was the only one who could keep his world from bleeding out. The morning reality had turned into a midnight mission, and as Janelle stepped into the sterile glow of the exam room, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just working a shift. She was starting a life. The transition from the frantic pace of East Side Medical to the hushed, high-stakes efficiency of the clinic was more than a change of scenery, it was a shift in Janelle's soul. Within weeks, the midnight navy scrubs felt like a second skin, and the biometric scanners no longer felt like something out of a spy novel. They felt like safety. Because the clinic was off the grid, the traditional boundaries of a hospital shift didn't apply. There were no set break times and the staff was minimal. Often it was just Janelle, a veteran nurse named Mrs. Cho, and the silent, watchful presence of Min-jae. He was always there, usually in the glass-walled office that overlooked the central hub, a silhouette of quiet power. It began with a meal. Janelle had been in the middle of a complex dressing change for a patient who had survived a knife wound when Min Jae appeared at the door. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited until she had secured the final layer of tape. "You haven't eaten in 8 hours," he said, checking a watch that likely cost more than Janelle's childhood home. "I have a patient. Mrs. Cho is taking over the vitals," he countered, his voice brooking no argument. "Come. There is a courtyard in the center of the building that the rain hasn't reached." The courtyard was an architectural marvel, an open-air square in the heart of the warehouse protected by a retractable glass roof. It was filled with lush ferns and the soft trickle of a stone fountain. On a small teak table sat 2 bento boxes, the steam rising into the cool air. Janelle sat across from him, the exhaustion finally catching up to her. For a few minutes, they ate in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. The food was exquisite, not the lukewarm cafeteria mystery meat she was used to, but delicate sashimi and perfectly seasoned vegetables. "Why do you do it?" Min Jae asked suddenly. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the way the light caught the water in the fountain. "You're young, you're brilliant. You could be working at a prestigious private clinic in the hills. Why the trauma wards? Why, this?" Janelle set her chopsticks down. "My grandmother was a nurse back in Georgia. She used to say that the world is full of people who want to be the sun, but very few people want to be the light in the basement. I guess I just realized early on that the people in the basement need the most help." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "What about you? I doubt you woke up one day and decided to become the man everyone is afraid of." Min Jae's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. He leaned back, the shadows of the ferns dancing across his sharp features. "In my world, fear is the only currency that doesn't lose value. My father was a man who believed in tradition and loyalty, but he was betrayed by the very system he tried to play by. I learned that if you aren't the one holding the leash, you're the one being walked. Is that all life is to you? A power struggle?" "It was," he admitted, finally meeting her eyes. "Until a woman who looked like she was carrying the weight of the city on her shoulders climbed into my car and fell asleep. You didn't care about my power. You didn't care about the lion. You just needed a place to rest." Janelle felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the tea she was sipping. The way he looked at her, not as a tool or a subordinate but as a person, was intoxicating. As the weeks turned into a month, these shared moments became the highlight of her day. They spoke of things that had nothing to do with bullets or bandages. He told her about his love for old architecture and the hidden corners of the city that remained untouched by progress. She told him about the difficulty of growing up as a caretaker, always being the one everyone leaned on, and how heavy that burden felt when there was no one to lean on in return. "You can lean on me, Janelle," he said one evening. They were standing by the biometric exit, the clinic quiet after a long day of treating 3 of his men who had been injured in a disagreement at the docks. "I don't think that's part of the job description, Mr. Kong," she joked, though her heart was thudding against her ribs. "Min Jae," he corrected softly. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her face before he slowly withdrew it. "And the job description ended the moment you kept the blanket." The air between them was thick with unspoken things. Janelle realized then that her guarded heart was no longer quite so guarded. She had seen the man behind the mask, the man who valued loyalty above all else, who treated his men with a stern but genuine fairness, and who looked at her with a hunger that wasn't just physical. He was hungry for the peace she brought with her. But with that connection came a terrifying realization. The more she cared for him, the more she had to lose. She was no longer just a neutral healer, she was becoming a part of his life, a soft spot in his ironclad armor. One night, while cleaning the surgical suite, she found him sitting alone in the dark, staring at a map of the city's shipping districts. He looked older in the shadows, the lines of stress more apparent. "Is everything okay?" she asked, stepping into the room. "There are movements," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The families from the north are getting restless. They see my private interests, this clinic, my shift in focus, as a sign of softening." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for her. "I've put you in danger by bringing you here, Janelle. I thought I could keep the 2 worlds separate, but I was arrogant." Janelle walked over to him, defying the professional distance she had tried so hard to maintain. She placed her hand on his shoulder. His muscles were like granite, tight with a tension that seemed impossible to break. "I knew the risks the moment I took the Navy scrubs," she said firmly. "I'm not a victim, Min Jae. I'm an adult who made a choice. And I'm not leaving." He reached up, his gloved hand covering hers, pressing it closer to his neck. The leather was cool, but the warmth of his skin beneath it was grounding. In that moment, the clinic, the mafia, and the chaos of the city faded away. There was only the rhythmic sound of their breathing and the rare, fragile connection that had bypassed every defense they both possessed. They were two people from opposite ends of the universe, brought together by a mistake in a rainstorm, now tied together by a bond that was becoming more dangerous than any wound she had ever treated. The shadow was no longer just an invitation, it was a home. And as Janelle looked at the man who ruled the underworld, she realized she was no longer just a nurse. She was his and he was hers, regardless of the blood that was sure to follow. The stillness of the clinic had always been its greatest asset, a sanctuary of white marble and filtered air that made the violent world outside feel like a distant memory. But on a Tuesday night that mirrored the storm of their first meeting, that peace didn't just break, it shattered. Janelle was in the sterilization room, the rhythmic hiss of the autoclave providing a steady backbeat to her thoughts. She was thinking about the way Min-jae had looked at her that afternoon, a fleeting, unguarded moment of warmth before he'd left for a logistics meeting near the shipping yards. He had promised to be back by midnight. He had promised they would share tea in the courtyard. The alarm triggered first, a low, vibrating pulse that thrummed through the floorboards. Then came the sound of the heavy steel doors being forced open with a violence that made the medical supplies on the shelves rattle. "Janelle, get to the bay. Now." Mrs. Cho's voice was uncharacteristically high, sharp with a panic that sent a cold spike of dread through Janelle's chest. She dropped the tray of instruments she was holding, the metallic clang echoing like a gunshot, and sprinted toward the central hub. The sight that met her was a nightmare rendered in high definition. Two of Min-jae's personal guards, their suits torn and faces smeared with soot and blood, were stumbling through the entrance. Between them, they carried a man whose presence usually commanded the very air in the room. Now Min-jae was a dead weight, his head lolling back, his white shirt, that crisp, lethal armor, drenched in a terrifying, spreading crimson. "Ambus," one of the guards wheezed, his own arm hanging at a useless angle. "Pier 14. They were waiting. We barely got him out. Get him on the table. Move." Janelle screamed, her nursing instincts slamming into place with the force of a tidal wave. The fear was there, a screaming voice in the back of her mind, but she shoved it into a dark corner. There was no room for Janelle the woman right now. There was only Janelle the healer. They hoisted him onto the surgical table. The contrast was sickening, the pristine midnight navy of Janelle's scrubs against the visceral hot red of Min-jae's blood. He was ghost pale, his breathing shallow and ragged, a wet, whistling sound that told her everything she needed to know about the state of his lungs. "Janelle?" He rasped, his eyes fluttering open for a fraction of a second. His hand, no longer gloved, reached out feebly, his fingers searching for hers. They were cold. Too cold. "Don't speak, Min-jae. Just look at me," she commanded, grabbing a pair of trauma shears and beginning to cut away the silk of his shirt. "Keep your eyes on me." The damage was extensive. 2 entry wounds, one high in the shoulder, the other dangerously low in the abdomen. The abdominal wound was the one that made Janelle's stomach drop. It was deep, and the blood was pulsing with a rhythmic lethality that signaled a hit to a major artery. "Mrs. Cho, I need 3 units of O-negative, a central line kit, and the vascular tray." Janelle shouted, her hands moving with a speed she didn't know she possessed. "And get the cautery unit warmed up." The next hour was a blurred montage of desperation. The clinic, once a place of quiet conversations and shared secrets, became a battlefield. The air was thick with the smell of copper and ozone. Janelle worked with a frantic, focused intensity, her sneakers slipping on the marble floor as she fought to stave off the shock that was trying to claim him. Every time his heart rate plummeted on the monitor, the high-pitched beep felt like a physical blow to her own heart. She was talking to him the whole time, her voice a low, steady stream of anchors. "You don't get to leave me like this, Min-jae. You don't get to invite me into your world and then disappear. Stay with me. Breathe for me." She found the bleeder, a jagged tear in the iliac artery. Her fingers were deep in the wound, applying pressure that was the only thing standing between him and the void. As Mrs. Cho prepped the bypass, Janelle looked down at his face. Even in this state, his jaw was set with a stubborn, primal defiance. He was fighting. But the monitor began to wail again. His blood pressure was bottoming out. "He's crashing," Mrs. Cho cried, her hands hovering over the defibrillator paddles. "Janelle, we're losing the rhythm." "No," Janelle yelled, the word tearing from her throat. She looked at the man she had come to love, the man who had watched her sleep, who had given her a home in the shadows, and who had shown her that mercy was the most powerful weapon of all. The weight of the moral gray area she had accepted weeks ago finally came full circle. This wasn't a patient in room 4. This wasn't a nameless courier or a scarred soldier. This was the man who held her soul. If he died on this table, the light she had tried to bring into the basement would go out forever. Charge to 200. Janelle ordered, her voice trembling but certain. She took the paddles from Mrs. Cho, her eyes fixed on the flat line of the monitor. Clear. Min-jae's body jolted, a violent spasm against the table. The line remained flat. Again. 300. Clear. Another jolt. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain starting to lash against the retractable roof above, a mirror of the night they met. Janelle stood there, the paddles heavy in her hands, her breath hitching in her chest. Please, she prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Not him. Take the job, take the safety, just don't take him. Then a faint, erratic blip appeared on the screen. Then another. It was weak, stuttering like a dying candle, but it was there. Sinus rhythm, Mrs. Cho whispered, tears finally breaking through her professional mask. We have a pulse. Janelle didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. She spent the next 3 hours suturing, cleaning, and stabilizing, her hands moving with the grace of a woman who had finally accepted her destiny. She was no longer just a nurse from East Side Medical. She was the woman who had dragged the king of the underworld back from the gates of hell. As the first light of dawn began to turn the glass roof a pale, watery gray, Janelle finally stepped back. Min-jae was intubated, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical help of the ventilator, but he was alive. His skin was still pale, but the deathly gray had receded. She slumped into a chair beside his bed, her midnight navy scrubs almost black with his blood. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had once hovered near her face in a car, afraid to touch her. She pressed his knuckles to her forehead and finally, for the first time since the alarm had sounded, she let herself cry. The peace of the clinic was gone, replaced by a grim, heavy reality. The war had found them, and while she had won this battle, the cost was etched in the blood on her hands. She looked at Min-jae, his face peaceful in its medically induced sleep, and knew that the next step would require more than just a scalpel. It would require a transformation she was only beginning to understand. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator was the only thing keeping the silence of the clinic from becoming absolute. Min-jae had survived the night, but by morning the limitations of their off-the-grid sanctuary were beginning to show. Despite the high-end diagnostic machines and Janelle's tireless care, Min-jae's body was failing in a way that standard triage couldn't fix. One of the bullets had fragmented near his spine, and a secondary bleed was developing, one that required a level of neurovascular expertise that even the most talented trauma nurse didn't possess. Janelle stood by his bed, her eyes tracing the jagged lines of the heart monitor. She had cleaned the blood from her skin, but the metallic scent of it seemed to have stained her soul. Mrs. Cho approached her, her face a mask of grim exhaustion. His intracranial pressure is rising, Janelle, Mrs. Cho whispered. If we don't get that fragment out and relieve the pressure within the next 4 hours, he won't wake up. Even if his heart keeps beating, the man you know will be gone. Janelle looked at Min-jae's still face. The velvet over steel authority was gone, replaced by a fragile, waxen stillness. The guards outside were restless. The hit at Pier 14 had left the organization fractured, and rumors of Min-jae's death were already fueling a power vacuum in the streets. She couldn't take him to East Side Medical. His enemies had eyes in every public ER, and the police would have him in handcuffs before he was even prepped for surgery. She had to bring the mountain to the prophet. Janelle reached into her locker and pulled out an old laminated phone card she hadn't touched in 3 years. It belonged to Dr. Eris Thorne, a retired surgical legend who had been her mentor during her residency. Thorne was a man who lived by a strict, almost archaic code of ethics. A man who had left the profession in disgust over the bureaucracy she now navigated daily. He was also the only person she knew with the steady hands and the lack of a paper trail necessary to save a Mafia boss. She stepped into the courtyard and dialed the number. The rain had stopped, leaving the air damp and heavy with the scent of wet stone. Janelle? Thorne's voice was gravelly, the sound of a man who had spent too many years shouting over the din of operating rooms. It's nearly 5 in the morning. Unless you're calling to tell me you finally quit that soul-crushing hospital, this better be life or death. It's both, Eris, Janelle said, her voice trembling but holding firm. I need a favor. The kind of favor that stays off the record. The kind that ends careers if people find out. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end. Where are you? I'll send a car, she replied. Please. I've never asked you for anything, but if you don't come, a man is going to die. A man who saved me before I even knew I needed saving. An hour later, the black sedan glided into the industrial warehouse, carrying a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Dr. Thorne stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the biometric scanners and the high-grade security with a look of profound disapproval. When he walked into the clinic and saw Janelle in her midnight navy scrubs, his eyebrows shot up. So this is where you went, he muttered, dropping his vintage leather medical bag on a pristine counter. The shadows. I should have known you were too good for the light, Janelle. He's in room 1, she said, ignoring the judgment. I've prepped the theater. I'll be your first assist. Thorne walked to Min-jae's bedside, his clinical gaze taking in the monitors and the intubation. He checked Min-jae's pupils, then looked at the scans Janelle had run an hour prior. Do you have any idea who this man is? Thorne asked, his voice low enough only for Janelle to hear. This is Min-jae Kang. He isn't just a patient, he's a tectonic plate. If he shifts, the whole city feels it. I know exactly who he is, Janelle said, stepping into Thorne's space, her jaw set. He's the man who kept me warm when I was shivering. He's the man who gave me a place to heal without the chains of a system that treats people like numbers. He's mine, Eris. Now, are you going to help me or am I going to have to do this myself? Thorne stared at her for a long moment. In her eyes, he saw the same fire that had made her the best student he'd ever had. A fierce, uncompromising loyalty that transcended the law. He sighed, reaching for a scrub brush. Get the anesthesia ready. And Janelle, if this goes sideways, we were never here. The surgery was a descent into a different kind of darkness. For 3 hours, the only sounds were the clinking of metal against metal and Thorne's terse, monosyllabic commands. Janelle worked with a precision that surpassed anything she had ever done at Eastside. She anticipated Thorne's every move, her hands steady as she retracted tissue and suctioned blood away from the delicate neural pathways. This was her proof. It wasn't just about medicine anymore. By bringing a man like Thorne into this world, by risking her mentor's legacy and her own soul, she was proving her loyalty to Min-jae. She wasn't just his nurse, she was his vanguard. She was the one who stood at the threshold between his violent life and the peace of the grave, and she was refusing to let him cross. Fragment is out, Thorne finally grunted, dropping a small, jagged piece of lead into a metal basin. The clink sounded like a victory bell. The pressure is dropping. The bleed is cauterized. He stepped back, his forehead beaded with sweat, and looked at Janelle. He's strong. Most men would have checked out hours ago. He must have something worth waking up for. Janelle didn't answer. She was busy cleaning the incision site, her movements tender, almost reverent. As she smoothed the final bandage over Min-jae's temple, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The moral gray area had resolved itself into a single vibrant truth. She would do it all again. She would call every favor, break every rule, and walk through any fire to keep him breathing. Thorne left as quietly as he had arrived, refusing the envelope of cash Janelle tried to offer him on behalf of the organization. Keep your money, Janelle, he said, pausing at the car door. Just make sure he's worth the risk I just took. You've traded your white coat for something much heavier. Don't let it crush you. Janelle watched the sedan pull away, leaving her alone in the quiet hub of the clinic. She walked back to Min-jae's room and sat in the chair she had occupied for the better part of 2 days. She took his hand. The skin was warmer now, the pulse under his wrist strong and steady, like a drumbeat returning from a distance. She had proven her loyalty not with words, but with the high-stakes dance of the scalpel and the silent weight of a secret shared with a mentor. She was no longer a visitor in Min-jae's world. She was its heartbeat. And as she sat there, watching the monitor's rhythmic green line, she knew that when he finally opened those dark, lethal eyes, he would find her right where she belonged. The transition from the ventilator to natural breath was the quietest victory Janelle had ever witnessed. It was the 3rd day since the surgery, and the clinic was bathed in the soft, bruised light of a pre-dawn sky. When Janelle finally pulled the tube from Min-jae's throat, she didn't see a patient recovering. She saw a man returning from a far-off country, one where he had been prepared to stay. His eyes opened slowly. For a long second, they were unfocused, reflecting the sterile white of the ceiling, but then they sharpened, finding Janelle. The lethal, unreadable mask of Min-jae Kang wasn't there yet. Instead, there was a raw, naked vulnerability that made Janelle's breath catch in her throat. "You're here?" he rasped, the sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "I told you I wasn't leaving," she whispered, her hand finding his. His grip was weak, but his fingers hooked into hers with a desperation that spoke of the shadows he'd just escaped. He looked around the room, taking in the monitors, the 4 stands, and the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic and sandalwood. He noticed the exhaustion etched into the lines of Janelle's face and the way she still wore the navy scrubs, now wrinkled and stained with the toil of his survival. He knew, with the intuition of a man who survived by reading the unspoken, that she had done the impossible. The ambush. He began, his voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. The organization. There will be a reckoning, Janelle. My enemies, they know I survived. This place isn't a sanctuary anymore. It's a target. Janelle didn't flinch. She sat on the edge of the bed, leaning in close until their foreheads touched. I know. Mrs. Cho told me the guards have been doubling the perimeter. I know that the world outside this door is on fire. Min-jae's eyes searched hers, looking for the fear that should have been there, the regret that would have been natural for a woman whose life had been safe only weeks ago. You can still walk away, he said, the words clearly costing him. I can have a car take you to the airport. New name, new city. Thorne can get you a job at any hospital in the country. I will ensure you are never found. You don't have to be the light in this basement anymore. Janelle looked at him, really looked at him. She thought about the 12-hour shifts at East Side, the endless paperwork, the patients who were numbers, and the soul-crushing fatigue of a life where she felt invisible. Then she thought about the man who had watched her sleep, the man who had shared his secrets in a rain-drenched courtyard, and the man whose heart she had literally held in her hands. I spent my whole life being safe, Min-jae, she said, her voice a steady anchor in the quiet room. I followed the rules, I stayed in my lane, and I was dying on the inside. My safe life was a cage. This. She gestured to the room, to him, to the dangerous, complex reality they now shared. This is the first time I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. She reached out and traced the line of his jaw, her touch feather light. I'm not a nurse because I like the smell of bleach. I'm a nurse because I don't turn away when things get hard. And you, Min-jae Kong, are the hardest thing I've ever had to face. I'm not leaving you to fight this alone. A tear escaped Min-jae's eye, a rare and startling sight on a man built of stone. He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed her palm, a gesture of surrender that was more powerful than any order he'd ever given. The path ahead is dark, he warned, though his voice now held a note of hope. We will have to build something new. A different way of doing things. No more shadows for the sake of shadows. If you stay, you aren't just my medic. You are my conscience. I can live with that, Janelle said, a small, weary smile finally breaking through. As long as you're the one holding the door. In the weeks that followed, the change was palpable. The clinic remained, but its purpose shifted. Under Janelle's influence, it became more than a stopgap for the wounded. It became a genuine place of healing for the neighborhood, a secret but vital organ in a city that had long ignored its most vulnerable. Min-jae governed his world with a new kind of iron, one that was still cold and firm, but tempered by the mercy he had seen in the woman who loved him. There were still black sedans and hushed conversations. There was still the weight of a pistol beneath a tailored jacket and the constant need for biometric locks. The danger hadn't disappeared, it had simply become the weather they lived in. One evening, months later, Janelle stood in the courtyard of Min-jae's penthouse. The city lights twinkled below like a field of fallen stars. She was wearing a dress of dark silk, but she still had her nursing bag slung over her shoulder, ready for a late-night call to the clinic. Min-jae stepped out from the shadows of the doorway, his silhouette as sharp and commanding as the night they met. He walked over and wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against the warmth of his chest. He smelled of rain and sandalwood, a scent that had become her definition of home. Are you happy, Janelle? He asked, his chin resting on her shoulder. Janelle looked out at the city, at the world she had once tried to navigate by the rules, and then back at the man who had shown her a different way. She felt the weight of the choice she had made, the choice to stay, to love a man of violence, and to find her own power in the gray areas of life. It's not perfect, she said, turning in his arms to face him. It's dangerous, it's complicated, and I'm pretty sure I'm breaking at least a dozen laws a day. She reached up, her fingers tangling in his hair, and pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of absolute, uncompromising devotion. But it's real, she whispered against his lips. And for the first time in my life, Min-jae, I'm not just surviving. I'm living. The black sedan was waiting downstairs to take them to the clinic, but for a few more minutes they stood together in the moonlight, a nurse and a king, two survivors of a rainstorm who had decided to stop running and build a kingdom in the shadows. The morning reality had become a permanent dawn, and as they walked toward the elevator, Janelle knew she would never look for a rideshare app again. She had already found the only man who knew exactly where she was going.